How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Lamed something. Daf Lamed Zayin? Sure. Of Masechta BavaBasra. Gewaltig. Shall we just jump in? Okay. So we're going to start in Daf Lamed Vav Amud Beis, about 4 lines from the bottom, 5 lines from the bottom, 5 lines from the bottom, 4 or 5 lines from the bottom, maybe 6, I think 5. Omer Bishmal Bomet V'Amur B'Stei Alavon. Okay, so our Mishnah, of course, had started out talking about Stei Beis Hashlachin, where it's Shalosh Shana Miyom Liyom to have in order to establish a chazaka. And then we talked about a Stei Beis HaLavon, which relies on rainwater, and Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva had these creative opinions where you could actually have a chazaka in less than 3 years. Rabbi Shmuel said 18 months, Rabbi Akiva said 14 months. And then Rabbi Shmuel kind of gets further, kind of digs a little deep. I don't know what I'm looking to say. He kind of like categorizes maybe further, and he says, now, what does he say? Stei halovon. That's dafka by stei halovon, by like a wheat field kind of thing. But by stei ha'ilon, trees, as we're going to see, right? So meaning, let's say you have a field, let's say you have a property that has fig trees and olive trees and grapevines. So in that case, you can take, says Rabbi Shmuel in the Mishnah, and we said yesterday, that's Rabbi Akiva Oichit, that you can have a chazaka even in 1 year. How can you have a chazaka in 1 year? Well, if Ruvain harvests the figs when they're ready, and then he harvests the grapes when they're ready, and then he harvests the olives when they're ready, and Shimon doesn't say anything, and he harvests 3 separate crops, so that would be a chazaka even in 1 year. Now, the Chachamim, however, argue on that and say that you can't do that you can't have a chazaka in just 1 year. However, what the Gemara is giving me medayik right now is that the Chachamim argue with Rabbi Shmuel in that they say you can't condense this chazaka into 1 year. But they do agree with Rabbi Shmuel that so long as this is divided, spread out over 3 years, then it would be acceptable. Meaning, if you have a scenario where, for example, you would harvest, we're going to get into a little bit more details in a minute, well, a few minutes probably, but let's say you have kind of some kind of scenario where let's just say you're harvesting the grapes in year 1, and then in year 2 you harvest the olives, and in year 3 you harvest the figs. So Kilu, you have 3 separate harvests, you're harvesting 3 different things, but as long as it's spread out over 3 years, that would be okay, right? The Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi Shmuel in that you can't condense it to 1 year, but sort of being able to establish your chazaka by harvesting figs, grapes, and olives, and establishing 3 separate years that way, or harvests that way, that would be acceptable as long as it's over 3 years. You can't condense it to 1 year. So now, Amar Abai says, Abai Rabbi Shmuel Nishma Rabbanon, that from Rabbi Shmuel's opinion, who says that you can establish your chazaka in just 1 year by harvesting grapes, olives, and figs, Nishma Rabbanon, we can infer that according to the Rabbanon, they disagree and say you can't condense to 1 year, but as long as you spread out the same scenario over 3 years, it would be acceptable, and therefore, Hayulo Shloshim Ilanos Mimato Asor Leves Soya, right? So we learned the other day that in a Beis Sa'ah, an area of 50 amas by 50 amas, you could plant 10 trees, alright? So if you have 30 trees spread out over 3 Beis Sa'ahs, okay? So Lo Shloshim Ilonis, if you had 30 trees, Mimata Asor Leves Sa'ah, configured in a configuration where you have 10 trees per Beis Sa'ah. Ochol asare b'shanezo. If he eats 10, if he harvests 10, and I guess eats 10 of the trees in this year. And then the next year, he harvests a different 10. And in the third year, he harvests a third 10. So he basically is harvesting in this year this crop, in the next year a different crop, in the third year a third crop. Harezo chazaka. And that would be a chazaka. Lav mi omer Rabbi Shmuel, because after all, did Rabbi Shmuel not say, meaning Rabbi Shmuel said, Chad pera ave chazaka l'chulu pere, that when you harvest, because Rabbi Shmuel says that by harvesting the grapes, and then the olives, and then the figs, you can have a chazaka of 3 years condensed into one. So what it must mean is that when you harvest the grapes, it's like you're harvesting the entire field, the grapes, the olives, the figs. When you harvest the olives, it's like you're not just harvesting the olives, but you're harvesting everything. And when you harvest the figs, you're not just harvesting the figs, it's like you're harvesting my speech. I'm like not saying words. It's like they're just not being pronounced properly. But the funny thing is, yesterday's daf I recorded this morning. What time is it right now? It's 3:45 in the afternoon. I recorded the other one at about 7 in the morning. Then I was still not fully awake, so I was like mumbling my words. But now I'm awake, and but still I'm like blah, 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 blah. I'll go upon him. As I said this morning, are you used to it when I speak in mumbled tones? It's okay with you? So Bishmael says that when you harvest each crop, it's like you're harvesting the whole field. So when you harvest the grapes, it's like you're harvesting the whole field. And then when you harvest the olives, it's like you're harvesting the whole field. And then when you harvest the figs, it's like you harvested the whole field nachamal a third time. So that's how you get your chazaka. So here oichit. So chaper avi chazaka l'chulu pere. So achanami here oichit. Ahane avu chazaka lahane v'anu so when you harvest these 10 trees, it's like you're harvesting, right, in the first year, so it's like you're harvesting all 30 trees. And then when you harvest the second 10 trees in the second year, it's like you're harvesting all 30 trees. And then when you harvest the third 10 trees in the third year, it's like you're harvesting nochamal, all 30 trees. So by the end of the third year, it's either like you harvested the Gans field 3 times. Alright. Gewaltig. Vanimile heicha deloy afiku achrine aval afiku achrine veloy ochol lahavi chazaka vu de baze baazuze. Torah. And now however, the Gemara adds 2 caveats. Caveat number 1 is that this whole thing about harvesting 10 this year, 10 the next year, 10 the third year, is specifically when there are only 10 ready to be harvested this year, and there are only 10 ready to be harvested next year, and there are only 10 to be harvested the third year. Rav Ashi points out there's some kind of, I guess there's some kind of something that like it takes like maybe it yields every 3 years or something. So potentially you can have these 10 trees already this year, the next 10 trees already the next year, and the third 10 trees already the third year. So long as out of the 30 trees there only are 10 to harvest each year, so this is an acceptable way to make a chazaka. You harvest what is available this year, what is available next year, what is available the third year, and it's key that you made a chazaka on the entire field each year over the course of 3 years. And secondly, with the bazuze, that they have to be spread out throughout the field. So kilu, each base core can be treated like its own field. So if all of the 10 trees are bunched together in this base core, and then in the other base core, and then in the third base core, and year 1 you harvest this base core, and year 2 you harvest that base core, and year 3 you harvest this base core. So those are considered 3 separate fields, and you can't make a chazaka on one field for another. So it would have to be, apparently, were you to have some kind of property where you planted figs and olives and grapes, you would have those spread out throughout the field. Apparently, you wouldn't, I'm not a farmer, but you wouldn't have, I guess, like a section for your grapes and a section for your figs and a section for your olives. They would all be scattered about. So that's the scenario where we said that harvesting the grapes, it's like you harvest the whole field, and harvesting the figs, it's like you harvest the whole field, and harvesting the olives, it's like you harvest the whole field. So here, these trees would have to be spread out throughout the throughout all the 3 Beisa'as in order for, harvesting 10 this year to count for all 30 of them, and 10 the next year to count for all 30 of them, and similarly the third year. But if they're all, if it's like one Beisa'ah at a time, then, harvesting that Beisa'ah can only count for that Beisa'ah. It cannot count for the other ones. Fine. Gewaldig. Okay. Zog the Gemara. Ze hechzik ba'ilonis v'ze hechzik bikarka. The chazaka that we're talking about, as we mentioned 2 days ago, I can't remember anymore, that, of course, I think that was maybe yesterday. I think so. That, of course, there are different kinds of chazakas, right? The chazaka we've been talking about is kind of like a replacement for a shtar, right? That since eventually you might lose your document, so this is kind of a replacement for a document. But of course, we also know that karka is nicknamed bekesev shtar uv chazaka, and there are ways of making a chazaka as a way of making a kinyan, which we're going to get to, I believe, later this week on Daf Mem Beis. I think we're going to start getting into that sugya, which I'm very interested in, because we've been talking about chazakas, being kona things with chazaka for so long. I'm looking forward to understanding exactly how that works. Feels like I'm back in Perek Hazov in Bav Metzia when we learned exactly how kinyan kesef works and kinyan chalifin. That was gewaldig. I'm very curious to see what we're going to have to say about kinyan chazaka. Al koponim, that is the kind of chazaka we are talking about now. So if you have Levi who sells his field to Ruvain and Shimon, Ruvain is kone the trees bechazaka, and Shimon is kone the land bechazaka. So Shimon gets the land, Ruvain gets the trees. All right. And they're kone bechazaka, ach weiß nicht. They worked the land a little bit. I don't know, maybe Shimon put a fence around the land, maybe Ruvain dug a shtickle, by the tree, I guess. I don't know, did something by the tree. So they were kone bechazaka. Okay, so zechzik bilonis. So Ruvain now owns the trees. Zechzik bikarka. Shimon owns the land. Gewaldig. Omer of Zvid, says Rav Zvid, zeh kone ilonis, v'zeh kone karka. Okay, beseder. Ruvain owns the trees. Shimon owns the land that the trees are on. Maskefla Rav Papa, but Rav Papa asks a kasha on that. Imkain ein lo lebali lonis bikarka klum. But Rav Papa says, I'm uncomfortable with that explanation, because if you think about it, then Ruvain, who owns the trees, has no rights at all to the land. So then what happens when after 120 years, Ruvain's trees go to firewood, and Leimalei balakarka levali lonis, at which point Shimon's going to say to Ruvain, Akori loncha shkol vizil. Okay, well, your tree's gestorben, it's in firewood, and okay, the gig's up. Get out of here. Reuven says, wait, can't I plant another one? He says, no, it's my land. You bought the trees. The trees are gestorben. You're done. Shkol, akor ilancha, uproot your tree, shkol, take it, vizil, and be on your way. So Elam Rav Papa rather says Rav Papa zeh kona ilonos v'chatzi karka zeh kona chatzi karka. Rather, no. Reuven gets the trees. Says Rav Papa, Reuven gets the trees, but also half of the land. And half the land, it doesn't there's two opinions in the Rashbam, but I believe the first one is that half of the land doesn't literally mean half of the land. It means that Reuven doesn't just own the trees, he also owns whatever necessary parts of the land, whatever part of the land that will also be necessary for him to be able to maintain his trees, and if it dies, to be able to replant the trees, and Shimon gets the rest of the property. Again, so Rav Zvid says, this is going to come up in another few minutes, Rav Zvid says that Reuven has the trees, has all of the trees and none of the property, none of the land. Shimon has all of the land and none of the trees. Papa argues and says, but then if Reuven's trees die and go to firewood, so then Reuven he's done. Shimon kicks him off. So therefore, Papa's uncomfortable with that, and he says, no, Reuven doesn't just own the trees. The Oichid owns whatever land is necessary to support the trees. Oichid. Fine. Zogt de Gemara Pshita Mocher Karke V'Shiyer Ilonis Lefanav Yesh Loi Karke O Bara Ba. One second. Yeah. Okay. Fine. So, Pshita, it's clear, it's obvious. Macher Karka, that if Shimon owns Shimon owns everything. He owns the land, he owns the trees, he owns everything. Macher Karka, if he sells the land to Reuven, V'Shiyer Ilonis Lifanov. But he kept trees, and I think we're talking about Dafka 2 trees. Right, that's what Rashbam says. So, V'Shiyer Ilonis Lifanov, Afilu Einen Ela Beis. Right, because we learned the other day that if there are 3 trees, so then he also is shaykh to whatever land that's necessary for the trees, to kind of use and upkeep and stuff. So if Shimon sells the land, to Reuven, but he leaves for himself 2 trees, yesh lo karke, he doesn't just leave for himself the trees, but also whatever land would be necessary for those trees as well. And even according to Rabbi Akiva, whose opinion is that a seller is a generous seller, that if there's a question, was X included in the sale or not included in the sale, Rabbi Akiva says it's included in the sale. The seller is a generous seller, as opposed to the Rabbanan, who we're going to see soon, disagree and say that a mocher is mocher b'ayin ra, that he is not a generous seller, that the sellers generally will sell as little as possible and include in the sale as little as possible. Rabbi Akiva says that a seller is we generally view a seller as being a generous seller. So even according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that a seller tends to be generous, and therefore as a generous seller, maybe you would think that he would sell all of the land and leave none of the land for himself. However, even according to Rabbi Akiva, the Amar Mocher B'ayin Yofeh Mocher, who says generally a seller is a generous seller, Hanemile Gabe Bor Vadus, that specifically would be in a scenario, for example, if Shimon sells his land, but he keeps for himself a pit or a cistern. Pits and cisterns only take up their own space. They don't affect the area outside of it at all. And Reuven, who's buying the land, would be able to plant and seed and everything up until the rim of the pit or the cistern, and therefore Reuven's not, it's the pit and the cistern is very low maintenance, and Reuven's not going to have any kinds of problems with it. And in that case, we assume that Shimon is a generous seller, and he's selling all of the land up until the edge of the pit, because he knows that Reuven isn't going to give him a hard time, because after all, the pit is pretty low maintenance, and therefore he's a generous seller. Because the pit and the cistern don't weaken the land at all. Aval ilonis. However, in this case though, we're talking about trees. Trees weaken the land. They use the land, the roots, and it makes it difficult to plow and this and that. So it's going to become a headache for Reuven. And therefore, if Shimon sells the land to Reuven, but keeps the trees for himself, if he were not to include any of the land, keep any of the land for himself with the trees, well then he knows that inevitably Reuven's going to get upset, meaning if Shimon were to sell all of the land and keep 2 trees for himself, but none of the land that they need, well then he knows that inevitably Reuven, who bought the land, is going to get annoyed with Shimon and his trees primarily, because the trees are weakening the land. You got the roots and it's hard to plow and this and that. And Shimon knows that his days are numbered. Once these trees go to firewood, so then I feel like that joke is not as funny as I wanted it to be. Did you even get the joke? Did you get that firewood is like wellwood for trees? Firewood, wellwood, trees go to firewood. I thought it would be funnier. Alright, I'll have to find something else to be funny about. So in that case, Shimon knows that unless he includes land for himself, the land that the trees need, then he's in trouble, because when the trees die, he's not going to be able to replace them. Reuven's going to be like, I had enough, get out of here. So therefore, even according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that generally speaking, we assume that the seller is a generous seller, that's in scenarios where he assumes that, Shimon's being pretty low maintenance, and Reuven's not going to have any issues with him, and he'll be able to keep his deal where he has the pit and Reuven has all the rest of the land. But in this case, where Shimon knows that his trees are higher maintenance, and Shimon knows that unless he retains for himself land around the trees, he's going to get kicked off. Reuven's going to kick him off eventually. So therefore, with that knowledge, Shimon retains for himself he retains for himself the land surrounding the trees. Right? Shire, Shimon retains for himself the land around the trees. The Elo Shire, because if he doesn't do this, Lema Le, inevitably Reuven is going to say to Shimon, get out of here. Akori Lancha Shkol Vazil. When the trees die, take them and get out of here. So in order to prevent that eventuality, Shimon makes sure to keep some land around the trees for himself. Now what if Shimon sold the trees to Reuven, but he left the property for himself? Okay, so it's fakir. Shimon sells 2 trees to Reuven, but he sells just the trees, but he leaves the land for himself. Okay, so again, Machur Ilonis v'shir karka lefanim. So plukta Rabbi Akiva v'Rabbanan. Okay, so this is punkt. The machlok is between The machlok is between Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis that I mentioned. Rabbi Akiva says that we assume that Shimon is a generous seller, and therefore he also includes the land around the trees. And the Chacham say Shimon is an ungenerous seller, and he sells only the trees, no land. The Rabbi Akiva the Amar Mocher Bayin Yofe Mocher. So according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that a seller is a generous seller, Islay, so then Reuven has the land surrounding the trees. The Rabbanon Leislay. According to the rabbis who say that Shimon is an ungenerous seller, so then Reuven owns only the trees, none of the land. The Rabbi Akiva Islay, we say that according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that Shimon is a generous seller, Reuven owns the trees and the area surrounding the trees. Va'afilu li-Rav Zvid. And this is even according to Rav Zvid, right? Remember I said earlier that we're going to come back to this machlokes. Remember, Rav Zvid had said that when you have Levi who sells his property to Shimon and Reuven owns the trees and Shimon owns the land. Rav Zvid said Reuven owns only the trees, right? All of the trees, none of the land. Shimon owns all of the land, none of the trees. Rav Papa argued and says, no, Reuven also needs to own part of the land so that if it dies, he can replace it. So Rabbi Akiva said that when Shimon, however, owns the field and trees, and then he sells the trees to Reuven, so Rabbi Akiva says that Reuven also owns the land around the trees, and even Rav Zvid would agree in this case. Even Rav Zvid the Amr Ein Lo, who says in the other case where Levi sells it to Shimon and Reuven, that Reuven only has the trees and none of the land. That's when Shimon and Reuven are both buying from Levi. Shimon buys all the land, none of the trees, and Reuven buys all of the trees, none of the land. The Amalei, because Shimon in that case says to Reuven, look, look, I don't have any rights to the trees. I own all the land and none of the trees. So you oichit, you own all of the trees but none of the land. And what that means that if the tree dies, you won't be able to replace it. But in this case, but in this case, this isn't about Shimon and Reuven both as purchasers. In this case, we're talking about Shimon is the seller. And Mocher b'ayin yofeh, Mocher, Rabbi Akiva's opinion is, and he would say that Rav Zvid would agree in this case. Rav Zvid is an Amora, so he would have to agree, but meaning Rav Zvid is even aligned with Rabbi Akiva because here we're talking about a seller, and a seller is generous. But between two buyers, and they have to work it out between themselves, so Shimon could argue, look, I have all the land but none of the trees. You have all the trees but none of the land. Now the Rabbanon Leisley, and we said according to the rabbis, when Shimon sells to Reuven the trees, Reuven owns only the trees, none of the land. And even according to Rav Papa, who says that when Levi sold Shimon and Reuven the land, Reuven gets the trees and also the surrounding land. The Amar Yeshlo, the Rav Papa says that when Reuven and Shimon are both buyers, Reuven gets the trees and the land around it. That would specifically be when Shimon and Reuven are both purchasers. The Amarle, because Reuven argues to Shimon, just like Levi sold to you generously in that he sold to you a sale that you'll have forever. So Didinami, Zavin Bayan Yafe, he also sold me a permanent sale. Meaning, if my trees fall down, I'm able to replace them. Just like he sold you the land and you're going to have the land forever, he sold me the trees and I have rights to these trees forever as well. Which means that if the tree dies, I can replace it. But in this case, the rabbis would say, when we're talking directly between Shimon the seller and Reuven the buyer, the opinion of the rabbis is that Shimon is not a generous seller, and therefore he only sold the land. He didn't sell any of the trees. But what? In this case, Shimon sold only the trees, but none of the land. However, when Shimon and Reuven are both buyers and they're buying it from Levi, well then Reuven could argue, look, just like Levi sold you a sale that is forever, he sold me a sale that is forever, which means that he also sold me whatever land is required so that if the trees die, I can replant it. Givaldig. Amrei Nardoi, the Nardain said, Ochlon Ritzufin Ein Lo Chazaka. Okay, going back to Chazakas. So if Reuven's trying to make a Chazaka on a field, and that field is planted, is overplanted, right? We said that the way to plant a field is 10 trees per base sa'ah. This field was planted 15 trees per base sa'ah. It's too much. It's not sustainable. So that's not a chazaka. Right? I said in Adar Achim Ritzufin, if he's making a chazaka on a field, but the field is planted unsustainably, there's too many trees, ain't no chazaka, it's not a proper chazaka, because Shimon doesn't think, he doesn't say, wait, I have to be mocha over here. Reuben's being foolish over here. He can't establish a chazaka that way. But then Rav asks the kasha, if that's the case, I mishud aspasta, b'mai konila. Well, then how can you make a chazaka on aspasta? Because aspasta, I think, is just like animal food that you, I guess, don't care that much about, meaning you plant it very, very densely and you harvest it as soon as you can. So how are you supposed to make a chazaka on that? So Amarava rather says, Rava machron ritzufin ein lo karka. That what it means is that if Shimon owns the land and the trees and they're planted unsustainably, and he sells the trees to Reuven, he's basically, he knows it's unsustainable. He knows those trees are eventually going to die. He's just selling the trees. He's not selling any of the land around them. Reb Zera Ketanoi says Reb Zera, it's like a machlokas tanoim. Kerem shehu natua al pochis me'arba amis. If you have a vineyard that is planted too tightly, in that there's only going to be 3 amas between each row, it's too tight. Reb Shimon Omer says Reb Shimon Eino Kerem, it's not considered a vineyard. That's like Rav over here, who also says that a field that's planted unsustainably, too many trees in one area, is not considered a proper stei ilan that you can make a chazak on. The Chacham argue Arezo Kerem, it is a vineyard. Even if you plant the vineyard too tightly, we basically remove we view it as if every other row is not there, in which case you have enough space for it to be considered a vineyard. Amin Ardoy, then Adain said, Ayman de Zovin diklo lechavre. Say the Nardaeans that if Shimon sells a palm tree to Reuven, Koni le mishipule ad tehoma. So Reuven, who buys the palm tree, doesn't just own the palm tree, but he also owns all the earth, the land beneath the palm tree, all the way through down to China. Maskefla Rove asks a kasha. Why do we, meaning because the idea is that when Shimon sells the palm tree to Reuven, he's not just selling this palm tree to Reuven so that if it dies, he's done. No, he's selling the palm tree and also the ability to replant the palm tree if it dies. So he's selling him the palm tree and all the land beneath the palm tree so that if the palm tree dies, well, that's his land. He could replant it. But Maskefla Rava says, why is it so obvious that he owns the land under the palm tree all the way down to China? Vilema le kurkuma derishka zabinilach. Aku kurkuma derishka vizil. Let Shimon say to Reuven, when Reuven's palm tree then dies, let Shimon say, well, the gig's up. If I were to have sold to you saffron, I don't know, I'm not a farmer, so I don't know how saffron grows, but apparently I guess saffron is a one-time deal. I guess it doesn't grow, I guess. So meaning if I were to sell you a saffron plant, it would produce its saffron, and then you'd uproot it. And if I sell you this saffron plant and its yield, so once it produces its yield, the gig's up. So can't Shimon say to Reuven, I sold you this palm tree just like if I were to sell you a saffron plant. Once the yield is done and it's no longer producing, the gig is up. Here also, I sold you this palm tree until it will stop producing dates. Once that happens, the gig is up. Elo Amar Rava rather says Rava biba machmas taina. Well, if Reuven comes and he says, well, you sold it to me with the land beneath it down to China, and I have a chazaka. So he's coming with the taina and he's basically saying, look, I have a chazaka and I minoch zabin tavachat shnei chazaka be'etzim. One second. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So it's talking about a scenario where Reuven basically says, look, I have a chazaka on this tree. You sold me the land under the tree. So there. Amalei Makshisha Beit Rav Chizda Ravashi says Makshisha Beit Rav Chizda to Ravashi. V'ikorkma derishka zavlei my avlei lemebud. But what if Shimon's telling the truth? What if Shimon's saying to Reuven, look, Reuven, meaning what? We're not saying to Reuven, but what if Shimon is telling the truth? What if Shimon really did sell the palm tree to Reuven like he were to sell saffron, in that once it no longer produces fruit, the gig is up? Now Reuven's going to turn around and saying, no, you sold me the land oiche and I have a chazaka. What's Shimon to do? So well, within the 3 years, he should have been moche. He should have said to witnesses that, hey, by the way, Reuven is using my palm tree. It's not his, it's mine. Because if you don't say this, we saw this the other day, right? That the mashkanta de surah, the chosaba Hachi, that it's written in it. B'mishlam shnai ilin tepuk ira double kesef. That at the end of these X number of years, the land will revert without any money. Meaning, Shimon lent Reuven money, and the deal is Reuven gives Shimon a property. Shimon uses the property for an agreed upon amount of time. After which Shimon returns the land to Reuven, and they're considered even. The loan is settled. So let's say the agreed upon amount of time was 3+ years. So what if So what happens if at the end of the 3+ years, Shimon turns around and says, this is my land, I have a chazaka, I bought it from you. What's Reuven to do? He's stuck. What would the rabbis make a takana that's going to end up inevitably having Reuven lose his land? And even if not this time, but it's inevitable that there are going to be instances where the theoretical, what do we call the not theoretical Reuvens, but the Reuven template persona is going to end up losing his property. There are going to inevitably be instances of that. But in that case, with the loan, when the mashkanta the surah, Reuven at some point over 3 years should have had the foresight to be mocha and say, by the way, Shimon is only using my field because he has a mashkanta and it doesn't belong to him, it belongs to me. And if he doesn't do that, then he'll lose his field. But so what he needs to do is during that process, during the 3 years, he has to be mocha. So here, Shimon, who sells the tree to Reuven, and Reuven has his palm tree, within 3 years, Shimon would have to be mocha and say, people, Reuven is using my palm tree, but it's not his, it's mine. And when it dies, that's it, he's done. Cheve, that was Daf Lamed Zayin of Masechta BavaBasra. What did we even talk about? I can't even remember. Different kinds of chazakas. Actually, some interesting stuff about the trees and the land, and we saw the machlokes in Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanon about does a seller sell generously or not. Rabbi Akiva says yes. The Rabbanon said no. So machlokes in Rabbi Zvid and Rabbi Papa about when you have two people who divide up a land, one gets the land, one gets the trees. Does the one with the trees also get part of the land or just the trees? Rabbi Zvid says only the trees. Rabbi Papa says he also needs to have part of the land. So it's some interesting stuff. Peace out.